Hello everyone. Once again to another EA Live. It's been a while since we've done these. We're starting to do some pre-recorded things too, so you'll be seeing some EA Lives live in the moment, like this one that we're doing right now. But we will also be doing some pre-recorded stuff that we'll be uploading straight to our YouTube channel. So definitely, if you're not following us or subscribed yet to our YouTube channel, you should. That's the right place to see all the upcoming content. But again, every now and again, we will be doing these sort of live conversations, which we really enjoy. And today's Friday, so it's a chill day to have a live conversation. You've seen me before. I'm Pablo. I'm a webflow developer here at Edgar Allen and host of EA Live whenever we do them live as these sort of kind of conversations with featured guests, friends of Edgar Allen, internal members of Edgar Allen too. And again, you can subscribe on YouTube or you can follow us on Twitter too at Edgar Allen Co. Today, we're going to be talking. Well, I'm not going to be talking in a minute. I'm going to remove myself from the stream, and Kendra Rainey from our team at Edgar Allen is going to be talking with Courtney Garvin. She's a brand designer, and we're going to be talking about how to cook up a strong visual identity. It's going to be a nice conversation about brand design, visual identities, and definitely looking forward to seeing some of the audience questions too in the live chat. If you're there, just kind of as you're going with the conversation, if you have any questions for Courtney or Kendra, would be great to kind of respond to them live also. So without further ado, I will remove myself from the stream and bring in Courtney and Kendra. Here we go.
He's gone. I said, thanks, Pablo. I hope I was unmuted when I said that. So, hey, Courtney, it's nice to see you. Thanks for joining us today. I have known you for a very long time. And we've worked together a bunch over the last, probably going on 8 or 10 years now, I'm going to guess.
I feel like time's pass really fast.
Yeah. And so Courtney is a brand designer and I'm a brand strategist. So we are kind of paired together an awful lot to create brand identity and visual identity and brand strategy. And so I thought it'd be a great idea to talk to her today about sort of the ingredients or the basics of visual identity and how to bring that to life, because that's something that is from my perspective, super important to a down the way a website design, but to creating a company that's memorable and that speaks to its audiences in a really clear way. So Courtney is an educator. She teaches other people to do this. And so she's a great person to kind of ask about this stuff. So I'm going to just start out by do you want to start out talking about kind of those two kind of like important parts of brand, and we can kind of go from there, and then I'll just pepper questions in when I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to share my screen now, or
go ahead.
Let me share my screen now. I've got some stuff kind of prepped for us, so let me share my screen. All right, hopefully can you see it says hello?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, awesome. And feel free to just, I'm going to kind of go talk through some stuff. So hello to everybody who's out there, either joining live or joining later. I'm excited to talk to you guys about brand design. As Kendra mentioned, that's something I do professionally as well as I also teach. So I kind of do both theory and practice. And Kendra and I worked together for years, kind of creating great brands. So sharing some insights and things that I've kind of paid attention to over the years. But when Kendra and I were talking about this, I kind of thought about it in terms of like two key takeaways. I always kind of think of like, if you remember nothing else, remember this. This idea of like what makes a good brand, balancing these two things, the idea of intent and then the idea of the environment in terms of brand. And so what I mean by when I talk about intent is really thinking about like, what's that character of the brand? What's the aspiration of the brand? A lot of times in brands, we talk about archetypes. Some of you may be familiar with that. It goes back to Carl Jung and psychoanalysis, but these kind of iconic patterns of behavior that we have throughout history with people. You have them in literature and stories and characters, but brands are characters, right? And so it's that kind of essential question of what does that brand want to be? I kind of think of it as a deep philosophical question. That's the first phase of creating a good brand is deciding what is that character going to be? What does that brand want to be in terms of personality and stuff? So that's kind of the first kind of key thing to remember. And then secondly is this idea of the environment, or if we're talking about the environment, is where is this going to live? Really being able to balance those two things. I think a lot of times people get focused so much on what the brand character is, but they forget and lose sight of it has to live in the world, right? Who's your audience or your customers or consumers? And then what's the reality of the world that this is going to exist in, both now and in the future? I think sometimes too, thinking about trends as they come about and kind of trying to future-proof your brand as much as you can, a brand, because everything's always dynamically changing.
Well, can we talk about those characters there for a
Yeah.
second? I got a question for you. So what are, let's say you're presented with a new brand, you've gotten the information about the product or the company itself. Like, what are some of the things that you're going to ask yourself when you start out, when you're kind of filling out that character, where you're like, is it a Homer Simpson or is it a Xena the warrior? So
yeah, I think the what is it? Is it Shakespeare to thine own self be true kind of thing? I think part of this is grounding it in the reality of the brand. If it's not an edgy brand, don't try to position, if that's not the kind of core of what that company or that product is about, the first thing I think is basing it in truth. What is the reality of what's the product or the service? But then also what's that aspiration? So it's kind of has to live in both worlds, because you don't want to promise something you can't deliver on. But at the same point, it should always be about the aspiration of a brand. A brand is never about reality. It's more about what could the world be like? What could, in the ideal situation. So it's always this kind of like, what I like about it is it's always this optimistic take on kind of the business or optimistic take on the world. So I'd start first there of kind of like getting to know like what that company or product is, and then kind of basing it on the kind of reality of what they are, and then also what the aspiration is.
Where do you in that process typically intersect with a person like me? Like, where does strategy come into that decision-making process?
Good brands have that from the very beginning. I'd say that the brands that aren't as strong probably kind of try to either don't have that or kind of try to tack on design at the end. I think the best brands, and Kendra, like working with you, is like when we can work in conjunction, that's like where the magic happens, where it's both the way that the brand behaves and speaks and the strategy undergirding it is aligned with where the visuals take it. That's kind of where the magic happens. When there's a disconnect, the audience, we pick, even more and more nowadays where we're all very brand savvy consumers, we can quickly detect when there's something that isn't aligned. So as much as the kind of the strategy and the design can kind of be intertwined early on, that leads to a much stronger brand in the long term.
I'm going to ask you more questions about sort of the intersection of strategy and design as we go on, because I'm always curious as to how, people in my position work best with you guys on the visual end, but I'll let you keep talking about where it will live, the environment, before I cut you off.
Yeah. I think, in terms of the environment, and that's always something to get to know, like who the consumer is. There's the book Zig and Zag. It's also understanding this brand is not living in a void, it's living in the world. There are other products and services that also are competing for attention and dollars for brands. So part of the reality of that also is understanding kind of who the competition is. I mean, you could think of it like literally as the competitive set, but also kind of expanding beyond that. What are the other brands and things that compete for your audience's attention. And it could be a direct competitor. It also, I like to kind of use the hypothetical when I'm teaching that I've created an ice cream store and I'm creating a brand for it. Well, part of the competition is like another ice cream store, but it could also be the hamburger stand next door. It's not directly competing, but it's still competing in terms of like if somebody's hungry, they're deciding between a hamburger and an ice cream. So kind of even expanding beyond like direct competitors to competitors that still are kind of vying for, your audience's attention. And then kind of looking also in terms of like larger trends that are happening in the world. I think that's where kind of thinking about a brand, how a brand lives. It's not just, I think, we're so busy in the making of brands. And I think that, it's such a huge undertaking to create a brand and to do it really well, that everybody's usually focused on the creation of the brand. But there's also that idea of once it's made, it's kind of a living thing that has to be maintained and kind of curated over time. So this idea of like where will the brand live? It's like literally living in the world, and how you kind of maintain it, from initial launch to the day to day to kind of weathering through, whatever may come up in the future.
What are some of the considerations you're thinking about when you're trying to create that aliveness? Like what goes into that thought process?
I guess I always kind of ask myself is, does this need to blend in, or does this need to stand out? There are benefits to both. And there's some, so I think that's kind of where you kind of, when you focus on where is this going to live, that helps you establish kind of where the way it needs to start to behave. And that informs some of these like ingredients. Now I can get to kind of more specific stuff in a second when I kind of talk about what are those ingredients that we're going to kind of cook with a brand.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, you were talking about audience. That reminded me of something that I always think about. You're talking about like, it could be the ice cream shop next door, but it could also be the hamburger shop. I always think of it as like mind space competitors. Like what else would, when you're looking, it's just, any kind of thing, you're going to want to look at what everybody else is doing in that world. Right. So you're making sure you're not, if your aim is to stand out, that you're not, being too close to something else. If your aim is to blend in, to be close enough. But what else are people choosing? That if they don't choose this, what else will they choose?
Right.
And sometimes it's a wild different thing, right? So it might be that, your ice cream shop is in competition with, not just the hamburger shop, but with like, I don't know, even like the coffee shop, or like the, or just eating at home, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you think about in terms of like larger trends, I'll just keep using the ice cream shop because it's a nice kind of easy thing to wrap.
We should talk, honestly, I didn't want to like beat this metaphor to death, but I set this up to talk about like food. So
perfect.
Anytime you can put that in there, we should have like a little like buzzer or something every time we mention food.
Perfect. I was going to say, the other thing is, thinking about trends long term. I don't know, or like a child of growing up in the 80s and 90s or whatever. Like, remember frozen yogurt being a huge thing?
Oh man, yeah, TCBY.
I don't know if you've seen the TV show The Good Place. Where the bad place is all frozen yogurt places. Kind of thing. So it's like just enough of what you want, but not quite what will satiate you. So thinking about, if you had done all this, investment in a frozen yogurt place, that kind of had a limited run and stuff. So even thinking in terms of like, I kind of think of it as almost like this expansion, you're kind of like, what is your direct competitors? And then kind of moving outward in these circles and then you get to the outward circles that are really kind of looking at these larger trends, whether it's like, nationwide, globally, over time, with your demographic, so much too with like, and, because Kendra and everything, I feel like we've been working on in the past, 5 years, looking at the demographic change in the United States,
right.
And how that all of a sudden has become a different audience where it used to be targeted to a certain age group. And now all of a sudden there's this much larger age group that everybody wants to try to make sure that they understand and can kind of meet their needs.
Well, yeah, we've been doing this long enough to have heard the millennials want X, and now it's the Gen, the Gen Zers want Y, so it kind of does. And it doesn't mean that millennials went away, or that, and we're
Right.
we're of an entirely different generation too, but or that we were never, in consideration. But it's, yeah, it's about audience, right? It's about looking from the perspective of who's going to be buying this thing. I did have a question. Like, you mentioned that sometimes you want to blend in and sometimes you want to stand out. What are some reasons that a company might want to blend in?
Oh, that's a great question. Because most of the time I feel like, especially nowadays, the word disruptor, like that's, everybody wants to be different, which I love the example of like the Nest thermostat, because like who would have predicted that a thermostat would be hot, kind of thing. Like that would be a cool thing, or a mattress, if you think about like Casper mattress. So there's kind of, I think, a lot more emphasis on kind of standing out, but there is a benefit too to blending in. For example, if you were some institutions, things like financial or banking, or things that you need, there needs to be a deep trust. Sometimes blending in is a better position for the brand, because it helps reinforce that sense of like security, dependability. Also, if you want to, I worked on a brand years and years ago that they wanted it to look like something that had been always around. It was a brand new thing, but wanted to, like not in a dishonest way, but just kind of give that feeling to the brand of the brands that have existed for a while. They kind of wanted to tap into that ability for a brand to make it feel like it's that's kind of solid and dependable. And so that was an instance where it really made sense to make the kind of look and feel of it feel like things that were familiar, so there's really kind of that like continuum of, it's kind of like how safe, where's that safety zone, being different is exciting and energetic and enlivening and stuff like that, which can be good for certain things, right? But there's also a benefit to the other end of the continuum. But the nice part is that there is that continuum. So that kind of goes back to that, who are you, deciding who you are and where that brand needs to be on that continuum.
Right. And that comes back to knowing your audience, knowing your business goals, knowing what the people that are buying your product or want your product are going to respond to, right? So one size certainly does not fit all.
No, I think that's the fun part too.
Yeah.
It's like, that's one of the fun things for me with branding is it's like, the distinctiveness of each one, and I think that's the fun part as being a designer is, I always kind of think of it, I think maybe you and I talked about this, like making it more them than they know that's them, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
It's like really kind of, I think when brands are done well, it feels like it should have always been that way kind of thing. You can't imagine it being any other way because it feels so true to what the company, the product is about.
Well, let's talk about how we build a brand.
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the fundamentals?
Yeah, some of the fundamentals. So the interesting thing about branding is, there is a complexity comes to branding when once you start using it and thinking of all the implications. Like there's definitely a huge complexity to it. I think a lot of times, in the news when they'll show, I remember, I don't know if you remember this, Kendra, but like when USA Today came out with their like rebrand, it was like the blue circle, and there was like the whole big thing of like all that for a blue circle. But what you don't realize is like the whole system underneath it, that it's not just that icon. I think a lot of times people get so focused on that icon versus like thinking about the larger system. But it's really this, it's like a good brand, really, it's just it's very few ingredients. We were talking, earlier about kind of cooking, and it's not that you have like this huge cupboard of tons of stuff. It's that you have few ingredients, but the ingredients that you're cooking with, that you're designing with, are very thoughtfully chosen. It's about the few, not about the complex complexity of the system, the use and the implementation. That's where that complexity comes in. But so one of the things I always try to emphasize is just that everything communicates, and that there is no neutral. I think that's another thing that people sometimes think, like that there's things that don't communicate. Everything communicates. And it's like, if you're not doing things intentionally, it's actually communicating the opposite, so that you have to be very intentional about the things that you choose. And the way I like to think about brands, or this is just me, but this is kind of the kind of core ingredients of a brand. If you kind of break it down into its elements, is thinking about, I should say visual brand, because there's also, you could expand it to like motion and audio. There's like this whole fascinating thing with like auditory brand experiences. But in terms of like visual brand, really it's these kind of few categories of ingredients, like looking at type, looking at color, looking at imagery, and then lastly, how you're using these all together, kind of these core ingredients. So I'll talk a little bit about each one, but Kendra, interrupt if you have any questions.
I absolutely will.
So what I have, the top two things are my favorite, type and color. So I have to say I kind of led with those because those are my favorite topics. But type, so I have an example here, just to kind of show type, the power of type. So I've got this, I love you. And this is a little bit inspired, I have to admit, by if anybody's seen the documentary Helvetica, there's an interview with Massimo Vignelli, and he talks about, I can say I love you with Helvetica. I can say if you want to be fancy, I could do it in Helvetica Light. So just to kind of have to show you kind of the power of type, and that words say things not in just what they say, but the way they look. So we can take this phrase, just I love you in Helvetica, inspired by Massimo Vignelli, or we could start playing around with type and how that changes the meaning. This is this amazing typeface, Speakeasy by Sud Tipos, that has these like amazing flourishes, right? But all of a sudden it's saying the exact same thing, but what it's visually conveying, that kind of translation or interpretation of it starts to change, where maybe it feels like more romantic. We can even start playing with other things and shifting that interpretation of it. This is Clavichord by David Jonathan Ross, right? That's got this like historic feel, but it's also a little bit funky. Again,
this is what your vampire lover says. I love you.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. It was a TV show, that funny one by Tycho.
Oh, What We Do in the Shadows. Yeah, that. Yes, that's perfect for that.
We write each other. Yeah, exactly. Or this is Chi by Ono Typeco. It's this really fun typeface that all of a sudden it shifts from being romantic to maybe being kind of silly or like whimsical, or we can even push it in some more. This is Cinderblock by Stefan Kjartansson, that like has this like assertiveness to it. So even though it's all saying the same thing, the typefaces that you choose can shift that interpretation of that message, and kind of goes back to that idea of like, what's the character of the brand, and using type to help convey that character through the type that you say, like not just in the words you say, but the way they look.
Do you typically start with type, or where do you start?
I start with type. And it takes quite a while to pick the type. I think that's another misconception. It's so easy now to pick type. You just go to your, pull down menu and choose. There's things that are already,
and the whole world is there.
The whole world is there. Yeah. Or it'll be like Google fonts, or like the general public is much more type savvy than they've had in the past, because our ability to access them is much greater. So I start with type, and I start just kind of going through and looking at all the different type, and kind of for those nuances, and kind of exploring what things, and I'll just start kind of keeping a list, or if there are typefaces I already have licensed and stuff, start kind of pulling ones out that I think kind of might match that brand character, and kind of hold on to those as I kind of build a bank of them to start kind of experimenting with. And it can be, it could be like kind of those wild swings like we just showed, or there's other like just these little subtle nuances of type that's also, it's like kind of both that macro and the micro. These are two different, kind of taking that same saying and two different typefaces. The top is Futura by Paul Renner, and the one on the bottom is a brand new typeface, Brisbane by Troy Leinster. Kind of at first glance, they may, it hurts me to say this, but to an untrained eye, they may look the same, I was like, they're totally different. but
look at that V. It's so
exactly,
yes.
Exactly. But so these little nuances where the top typeface is very geometric, which is great. It gives a sense of precision and exactness, but it's also kind of cold. One of the things about Brisbane that's really nice is like even just looking at the subtle difference between Futura and Brisbane in the letter E, like all of a sudden the Brisbane typeface, it's a lot more human, a little bit more friendly. You get just even these little nuances on the E or the little kind of tail on the U that give a little bit more character. So you can think about type in both of those ways, right? Kind of these like kind of heavy hitters of type that have this expression, but also paying attention to the nuances. And that can be another part where you can use type effectively in your brand, is kind of paying attention, not just kind of looking at the overall, but also paying attention to those little details and how they can kind of nuance the interpretation and the kind of vibe you get from the type. And there's, just kind of different categories of type, just for anybody who's not as familiar with type. Sometimes this is helpful. There's different categories. So if you're looking for a typeface to use for a branding project, it's helpful to kind of know these, just because it can help kind of point you in the direction. There are so many typefaces. I don't know, thousands and thousands. I saw one time a chart that showed like the rate of growth of typefaces, and it's kind of crazy. So that there was a time where I felt like I knew a lot of them, and there's just no way I can kind of keep up now. I mean, I love it, so I try to keep up as much as possible, but there's so many amazing typefaces out there. But so kind of knowing kind of what your goal is can help you kind of dial that in. And I included this just to kind of, if it helps to think about type on a continuum of kind of how unique you want it to be. There's kind of like, there's less, kind of like more straightforward. This is like where you're like kind of workhorse typefaces, to the other end of the continuum where something is like highly stylized. It's got a lot of personality, a lot of originality. So I've got Avenir there on the left, and like Hobo Rococo by Ornate Co. is an example on the right. And then sometimes, also there's like, there's stuff within that kind of that continuum. This is the middle is Bakewell by Kimmy Kirkwood. That again is kind of, seems, it's like it's got some similarity to Avenir, but it's got a little bit of like a detail at the top there. So one of the things you can think about with branding is, what do you need to help kind of bring that brand to life through type? Does it warrant something that's highly stylized, that has a lot of uniqueness to it? Or is it something like, if you're creating a large Fortune 500 company, you're going to have, this typeface is going to be used lots and lots of places. It's got to be really utilitarian. You might want something that's more on the kind of less stylized into the continuum. So that's something that I kind of keep in mind for like good brands kind of are conscious about choosing typefaces that hit that right spot of kind of originality.
I was going to ask you in that vein, about, you have that really, really fancy one over on the right, and the kind of more, as I said, you said utilitarian one on the left. Is there a calculation of like, okay, we can use a little fancy, like we'll use it here, but then we need a really standard typeface for something else? Like, how do you decide that ratio? Is it?
Yeah. It's usually, I kind of think of it as like kind of two tiers. There's like, either it's like the logo or headlines where you might want to have that uniqueness, again, because you're taking advantage of like the I love yous typefaces, where you're really using that type as a way to be able to help express some of the character or the emotion. But then if you're having pages and pages of type or long paragraphs, it works against you, because nobody's going to read long paragraphs like set in like highly ornamental type kind of thing. So that's where you kind of want to have both. You want something that both you can use practically as well as expressively. And I had a couple examples, just the Instagram, some viewers may have already I've heard of this, but Instagram had kind of come up with their own proprietary typeface. There's a kind of different trends in branding, and definitely proprietary typefaces is something that's kind of been on the rise and kind of happening more and more. But Instagram had come up with their own proprietary typeface that had this range within it to kind of play it a little bit more straight-laced, or other, moments where you could kind of bring in these other weights that had these kind of interesting kind of loops and stuff to give it a little bit more uniqueness. Because there was kind of a trend where everybody was kind of doing sans serif typefaces, and that's like starts to all look the same. So it's like, how can you kind of distinguish your brand from other brands by having something a little bit distinctive? Mm-hmm. So you can think about that in terms of like the messaging, the way you'd want to use type. The other thing is in actually the logo mark, the word mark for the brand. And I have this example in here just because everybody's familiar with the FedEx. If anybody hasn't heard about the hidden arrow in the FedEx, like you'll never see this world the same way. So yeah, there's a hidden arrow in between the E and the X. But sometimes things that look like they're just kind of typed out in a typeface are actually customized word marks. So you can see I just typed out FedEx in a typeface that, and it doesn't look anything like that. So that's the other thing, the way that you can use type in good branding is for your actual name of your company or your product, and doing some customization to kind of optimize those letter forms. And, potentially do other things like they have the Fed and the X kind of butted up against each other, kind of other kind of graphic kind of tricks, or there's there are these things, Gestalt principles, these kind of like optical tricks that you can play with things like negative space or alignment in the word mark itself. So that's kind of the first category of like ingredients when you're thinking about a brand, is kind of being really intentional about the type that you're using, why you're choosing it, and making sure that you're choosing it for reasons that kind of align with what the brand aspiration and the brand character is. The second kind of ingredient to cook with, which is also type and color, my favorite things, is color. I guess no one ever became a graphic designer, I guess, right? Is color. And this also kind of, I meant when the kind of the order of cognition, the visual is kind of something you see things before you read them. So color is like very, very powerful in terms of like brand recognition. And as consumers, we know that there are certain brands that are associated, certain colors that are associated with brands. They kind of become like a quick symbol of the brand. So just a couple examples, like T-Mobile had the pink, Tiffany's got their blue, and Home Depot has their orange, but each one's chosen strategically. The Home Depot, obviously the orange is like kind of evokes that idea of construction. The Tiffany's blue, has this like really nice ability to kind of offset the metallic, that like really showcases the jewelry. And then T-Mobile came about at a time, that magenta pink, when, kind of all kind of phone companies kind of looked the same, and they really wanted to stand out and kind of be like almost like punk rock, like a disruptor, kind of before disruptors were a thing, and chose this insane magenta that at the time just seemed like totally shocking. And it worked, right? Because it was to get people's attention and kind of get, even I heard someone say that like one of the biggest things with like graphic design is just getting someone to know that you exist, right? Just you think about how much stuff we ignore on a daily basis. Like our brains, and it's a good thing. Like our brains are kind of want to understand things so that it can tune it out. Like probably where everybody is sitting right now, nobody's paid attention at all to their ceiling, right? Because at some point your brain was like, I understand the ceiling, I don't need to pay attention to it anymore. So part of being able to kind of break through is with a brand is like, how do you even get noticed? And color can be a very powerful tool for that. So brands can use signature colors, but they can also use like signature color palettes. This was Headspace. They've changed their brand a little bit. It's a little bit brighter now, but when it first came out, this was very different than anything else that existed kind of in that app space. They used a really soft color palette, which did two things. One is it differentiated itself from other apps that all kind of had this kind of brighter, kind of that early kind of app look to it.
High contrast.
Yeah, kind of high contrast, real glossy and like shiny. This was all kind of subdued and subtle, but it was also very like calming, which like if we go back to like what's that character of the brand, right? They chose colors that align with that, like colors that reinforce what the actual app does, which is like this meditation kind of mental well-being app. So you can think about in terms of like signature colors or signature color palettes. And then back to that idea of like thinking about the environment that this has to exist in. That's another opportunity to use color strategically if you want to be on that end of the continuum where you want to be different, to stand out. One of the things you can look at is like, what is the environment? For example, like if it's healthcare, are there any kind of conventions that are used that you could do something different? So, if you look at, I just kind of grabbed a bunch of different healthcare stuff, but that kind of medical blues and aqua.
Medical blue, medical green. Yeah, it's
all kind of
ubiquitous. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you wanted to blend in, you would know exactly which kind of color direction to head in. But if you wanted to stand out, and I have an example of that, which is ZocDoc by Wolfolens, like totally different. Who would have thought like this electric yellow, a pink, these like kind of Easter egg colors, right? But if you really want to kind of convey that you're different than everything else that's out there, like color can be a really powerful tool to like help shape that perception.
And it's interesting you had Headspace before those too, because that is on sort of an edge of healthcare. It's and it looks even very different than ZocDoc, right? So it has, I think it had a similar desire to stand out, but they did it in a totally different way.
Yeah. So. It's interesting with like I'd say probably, definitely now with COVID, but there was kind of this like tipping point with medical stuff, with medical brands, where all of a sudden, like an Oscar is another brand that did something very different, had like these kind of like kind of cartoony characters. Like since then, that's kind of become a little bit more commonplace, but earlier on it was kind of, stood out as being very different. But there's been some interesting things that have happened in the medical space and branding in terms of, especially with companies that are doing something very different and they want to distance themselves from kind of the perception of healthcare and medical brands that have existed to like help say like, this is the way of the future.
All the healthcare tech companies and people are obviously breaking off from this in different directions now, but they felt very immediately like they were gravitating toward this sort of like appy SaaS kind of technology world, and merging that with this very kind of smiley, friendly little characters with their eyes kind of half closed, like Headspace kind of thing. And so what I'm always doing is I'm like, okay, so here, this is where we are now, and this is what disruptive is. So, what's next? Like, what's the next like jump that they're going to make to stand out? So
I see some medical brands that almost position themselves like, almost like a fashion brand, like, or a luxury brand, or like a spa kind of thing. It gets to that kind of, it takes away from like, I'm sick feeling and I'm sick and I need immediate help, to I want to be well kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. That's a total flip. Or I feel cared for as opposed to I feel, like someone's fixing something.
Gonna just like they're gonna zap that thing with a laser, versus like, oh, it'll be a pleasant experience as much as it could be, kind of thing.
Right.
And then another just an example of how color can be powerful in branding is you can kind of create a whole brand, like it can be like a huge distinguishing feature of the brand. This is the Sunbum sunscreen, which if you think about, there's certain product categories that have kind of color conventions. If you're walking down the aisle in the grocery store, you can look down and be like, oh, that's the detergent aisle, or this is the potato chip aisle kind of thing. There's like certain kind of colors. Again, it goes to that and knowing that environment of like blending in or standing out. But I remember when Sunbum came out, because I was walking down the aisle in a drugstore and I was like, immediately saw this because it was not like anything else. And it had this very distinctive yellow that was like yellow. If other sunscreen, if you think about like copper tone, like there was all kind of that like intense sun kind of yellow, or kind of that kind of more like sports sunscreen. But they used,
it felt very competitive.
yeah,
Like a sunscreen felt like, I'm not lying on the beach. I need to be out there, like, you know, hitting a ball.
Yeah, it's like, it's not just 50, it's 60 SPF, right? It's like it's competition. Yeah, that's a great way. Competitive sunscreen, which is kind of funny to think about it. But what I loved about Sun Bum was it flipped it to, it was not competitive at all. It's like, I always get this feeling like it's 1970s. I'm on the West Coast in California, the sun setting. I've just, you know, I've been surfing kind of thing. Like it's got this like chill kind of vibe to it. But the yellow was particularly interesting because it was this very soft yellow that almost looked like a yellow that was kind of had been kind of like bleached by the sun, you know, kind of thing. But so, you know, it's interesting because like they're, you know, it's sunscreen is sunscreen. I mean, I'm sure the manufacturer and the company would say that theirs had specific things that were different about it. But in terms of the brand, you know, all of a sudden the visual look of this becomes a distinctive kind of selling point to especially for new products to be noticed. And they did a really interesting thing too with looking at like that wood kind of to kind of coincide with kind of like the SPF. So that was kind of a creative way too to think about that with packaging.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I really like about this brand.
Oh, no, I love this brand.
Like to the point that I'm like, you know, I'm not like a surfer. This feels very kind of Venice Beach, you know,
Yeah.
but I would buy it just because it's cool and it's not a stark white copper tone tube, you know.
I know, I resist every time I walk past it because I'm just like, it's just so well done. I just want to buy. I just want to buy the little bottles because they're so beautiful. And then the last point kind of about color. So you can think about like a signature color palette, or kind of ways that you can use color disruptively. The other thing that you can think about in terms of branding with color is also its use and proportion. So I could say 3 brands that use red. I could say Coca-Cola, Target, and Chick-fil-A. Like their brand colors are all red. Now they would say that they're probably different types of reds, but just as a consumer, if you kind of think like what color, you know, you would say red, but each one uses them proportionally different, you know, where you think about Coca-Cola, it's heavy on the red. And when you think about Target, it's got more of that striping that they bring in. And if you think about like Chick-fil-A, it's really predominantly like white with like kind of a pop of red. So even with colors, how you use them can also be a strategic decision that you can make with your brand, you know, even beyond just choosing the colors, how you use them and the proportions in which you use them can be really powerful too. And then the last kind of ingredient before we start cooking is imagery. And imagery, it's weird. This is gonna be my shortest thing I'm gonna talk about, but it's actually probably the largest, but it's because, you know, there's just tons of ways you could go with this. But essentially, like in a brand, there's kind of like four things. There's photography, there's illustration, there's patterns or textures, and then there's iconography as ingredients to your brand system. And the important thing to think about with like imagery is, I'm gonna get super nerdy for a second and go into semiotics, which is looking at the like language and you know, the way that language works. But there's this concept of, or this idea of like the signified, which is what is that concept that the image stands for? So if I show you this, like the concept, what's signified is the idea of an apple, right? But there's this idea of the signifier, which is what is that particular visual form that's used. So these are all pictures of apples, right? But they're not, but they all kind of convey different things, right? That particular visual form is very important. And that's enough. This is, I think, one of the key ways that I see brands fail, or I guess, or maybe not be a strong brand, is that they're not picky enough about what the signifiers are, right? They're just kind of thinking, I need a picture of like a doctor, and I'm just going to use any, any kind of stock picture of a doctor, right? But what that particular visual looks like, whether it's photography or illustration or patterns or icons kind of thing, and especially with icons, like I see this more and more, is that, and, because there's a benefit, because there's kind of more image icons that you can kind of license or purchase, or kind of freeware ones that, that it's like, oh, it's good enough kind of thing, right? But that's where like really strong brands are very particular about what the type of imagery is that they're using, how they're using it, and what's that form, how does it look? So if it's a photograph, it's just not a photograph of like a bicycle. It's like, how you've lit it, how it's composed, any effects you put on it, and just being like really, really specific and particular. And this is really where it's like kind of narrowing down. It's not about having tons of options. It's kind of having a very particular, distinctive look to those images, whether it's photography or illustration or patterns or icons. That really can give your brand a visual distinctiveness and really helps kind of pull everything together. And then lastly, so those are the kind of the three things: type, color, and imagery, in terms of like, if you think about breaking it down and being intentional with each of those. So what type you're using, what color you're using, what types of imagery you're using, and thinking about it all going back to that kind of two parts of what's the intent of the brand, and then what's the environment that it's going to live in, and using that as the guide for kind of helping drive decisions for type, color, and imagery. And then the fun thing is like using it. It's actually cooking with all those ingredients. So again, it's not about complexity. It's about what few quality ingredients you're going to use. And then how do you kind of bring those together? And so I just kind of pulled a couple of my favorite kind of branding things that I've seen recently, just to kind of share with you guys, so you can kind of see each of these through that lens of type, color, and imagery. So Kendra and I, we were talking about that. What was the show that you said? I just grabbed Great British Bake Off.
Oh yeah, I was talking about Chopped, actually.
Chopped, okay. Right? They have all the ingredients.
Yes.
And then they just kind of cook differently. I like this picture because it's like, I've been on the Great British Bake Off where they all have that same thing. And then there's always the person that presents it and theirs is kind of falling apart.
This is probably a better metaphor, because with Chopped, like they give, 5 weird ingredients, and then there's no restriction on what you can make with them. With the Great British Baking Show, they give you the ingredients and they say, and a recipe. And they're like, you have to make this, and someone, as you said, fails miserably. Their cake deflates. They drop it. It's terrible tasting, something like that. So
yeah. So that's what's amazing is like, even and what I find fascinating about this is, the typefaces are all out there, unless you're like commissioning a custom typeface. The typefaces we're using for these brands are out there for everybody to use, whether it's like Google fonts, or you're like licensing a font from like a independent type foundry. Many brands will use those same ingredients kind of thing, but it's how you cook with them that can make the difference, kind of in the brand and the quality of the brand, or the quality of the whatever baked good this is. I don't know what this is, but some sort of
don't know.
I guess I don't know. But just a couple of examples. This was Block by Block. It was a Notion conference that the design firm Order did, and they use the typeface Enter, which is like really popular right now. It's kind of like a Helvetica kind of thing, but how they built visual distinction. If we think about it through those lines of type, color, and imagery, right? They had a typeface that's it's like more common. So they had to do other things to make it really visually distinctive, right? So they used color and these kind of pops of color, just highlighting the little people that kind of are kind of moving and building things with the logo and kind of the other elements in this particular brand system. They used illustration. These beautiful illustrations. I think I know the illustrator, but I'm not going to say it just in case I'm wrong. But his really great illustrations to add that little bit of character to it, and even like compositionally, like having a lot of white space, and just having really big type, really small illustrations. So you can see like it's kind of having those few ingredients and what are the rules around it, kind of created this really nice brand for the Block by Block conference. And then this was one of my favorite ones that I've seen recently. It was the kind of, I wouldn't call it a rebrand. It's like a refresh for Toblerone by Bulletproof, and they did some edits to the mark. And I remember when I first kind of saw like an alert come through, like on my text message that this was posted as like a new branding project. At first I wasn't like a fan of it, but then when I started to look at it, I was like, oh, this is really great. But if we think about type, color, and imagery, they use a very distinctive typeface. They have this like script, and then they have this like beautiful kind of customizable mark for Toblerone that they based on kind of the history and going back and looking at the kind of the history of the mark from Toblerone, and then bringing these like really great colors that kind of create that electric kind of vibration to create this energy that's like echoed also in the illustration. And then they did kind of some funky stuff with like placement of the logo kind of on the edge too. So that's kind of a neat dynamic thing that they did kind of compositionally. And then this is next. This was also one of my, I love it when they're, I love branding projects that, it's kind of like the Nest thermostat where you're like, oh my gosh, that thermostat is the most beautiful thermostat I've ever seen. It's like the same thing with this.
Like, thermostat. Yeah.
This, I was like, this is the most beautiful insurance I've ever seen. It's business insurance, but again, kind of like, if I go back to like, what's the intent of the brand and the environment? What this is Collins did this branding for Next. Something very funky and different. There's been a trend for a particular style of illustration, and it's happened so much that it's got a name of corporate Memphis, and everybody's kind of, if you saw it, you'd be familiar with it. But what they did for Next was choose an illustration style that hadn't been used. It's kind of this like retro 70s, kind of wacky, thing, but it's just a really fresh way to like re-visualize and think about kind of insurance, that like kind of thinking about the environment. This doesn't look like your grandfather's insurance kind of thing. Somebody
at Collins was watching Schoolhouse Rock. That's
what I know. Or do you remember that like keep trucking guy?
Yes. Yep.
The keep trucking guy kind of thing. And then this was one, Burger King by JKR. That was also, I think, kind of one of the top brand projects from, I think, 2022. And again, kind of what's the intent? And their intent was to like kind of tap back into kind of like the history of like Burger King and some of the earlier kind of flat branding. But then again, they just really enlivened it, because that kind of flat graphics could be kind of, might not feel enough like in a kind of fast food kind of environment. And so what they did was like bring in these like really wacky illustrations, this kind of crazy typography, these like really fun photographs that are also kind of a little bit cheeky, so there's just a lot of like whimsy and attitude in this, in the rebrand, which is like why I think it's gotten so much like great press and attention, deservedly. And then the last one I just pulled was, again, another kind of my favorite project kind of recently was the refresh of the brand for Carnegie Hall by Champions Design. They just did a gorgeous job. And again, kind of thinking about like the intent of the brand being, this is an established institution. It's famous, so that there's this need of continuity, but also this need kind of in the environment to like refresh it and kind of imagine it anew, but by still retaining what works. So, if we think about, again, through the lens of type and color and image, there's some really neat things. And if anybody's interested, I would definitely encourage you to go to their website and read more about all the kind of nuances, the reasons, the way they did the type. It's really cool. It's like kind of referenced by some of the stained glass on the outside of the building. And then just all these little nuances that are built into the word mark to kind of make it optically look as polished as it does. And then also this really iconic kind of icon with the lockup of the CH that they also pulled from historic references. So it's a great project too, just in terms of the depth that they went to kind of ground it in the history and the kind of the reputation of Carnegie Hall. So some things to share that are kind of some of my top favorites that I think do a particularly good job of being really thoughtful with their type, their color, and their imagery selection.
there's you know, from you talking through all of this, there's a lot of, obviously, just even with this Carnegie Hall example, a lot of, you know, research and a lot of kind of nuance and a lot of, you know, kind of references that are being made. And as a brand strategist, I have the benefit of being able to tell that story verbally. I can walk somebody through it. I can say, I can build all, you know, use the right kind of, you know, voice and tone and build that narrative. How do you deal with just being able to, like, you're showing some colors, you're showing, you know, a logo, you're showing some images. How do you deal with the subjectivity of that? How do you
yeah, because especially with color, that's very subjective. I think one of the things I always do when I'm talking about color is I always try to talk about the way color functions. That takes it away from the like, don't like, because we all have color preferences, and I have to work with colors that I'm not, you know, I have color biases. I have like this gray blue that's like my favorite color, and if I could use it all the time, I would, kind of thing. Colors I don't like, kind of thing, personally. But if I think about how that color functions, and that goes back to the intent of the brand and the environment it's going to be in, you know, it may be that I like that pale gray blue, but it would do horribly if it was a sports brand, you know, kind of thing, because of the environment that it's in, the intent of the brand, kind of thing. So that's kind of grounding it back to the intent and the environment it's going to live in can help think about how that color needs to function. And so that you can choose colors intentionally, and same thing with type too, kind of thing. And I think in terms of like presenting it, that's something I think always to show it in that context. This is chosen because of this kind of thing. And especially if you can show, you know, if it's like showing competitors, like, hey, all your competition is, you know, red.
Right.
Try that zigzag. If everybody's doing this, do that kind of thing. Right. Or if you want to blend in, if you're a medical brand and you want to blend in, then you kind of know which direction you have to do. I kind of, a lot of times with my students, I talk about being like a visual detective. You know, it's like we look at things, again, that goes back to the idea of everything communicates. Like we can look at things. You can drive past a motel and size up if it's a good motel, you know, kind of thing. Like it can say ocean view and you're like, it doesn't have an ocean view, kind of thing. But so all those little visual clues that are like indicating what the truth of that is. So a lot of times too is like, if you can kind of, if you're trying to create a brand, if you kind of really kind of use that detective part of your brain to look at stuff and say, okay, this feels energetic. If I break it down into those ingredients, why does it feel that way? Okay, well, maybe it's because it's using really bright colors. Maybe the typography is really big. You know, maybe it's got energetic imagery or active photography kind of thing. Sometimes I think it's helpful to kind of break it down into these kind of like baby steps to, you know, to kind of build up a brand from those kind of small decisions that kind of culminate into like the ultimately what it's kind of visually communicating.
Is there an industry or maybe even a type of company that is your favorite one their favorite puzzle to solve?
Favorite puzzle to solve? You know, I think one of the things that I love about what I do is I'm like a super curious person to, I don't know, maybe to a fault, kind of, when I stay up till 1 a.m. like researching random things kind of thing. I think my family is also like, oh God, she's talking about that again. But I love the variety. I think that for me, that's the fun thing is variety. You know, it could be a bank brand one day, it could be a kids brand another, it could be exhibit design. It could be, you know, you know, big, small. I like the range because I think it's also for brand, because that's kind of the fun part is like what's enjoyable. What I enjoy doing is like making the brand more of itself, you know. So that's the fun for me is when there's a variety, because it's you get to try different things, you know. It's like kind of boring if you're always kind of doing the same thing. I don't think I'd make a good in-house designer for that reason. I mean, in case I ever need to be employed in-house for anybody in the future.
We'll just delete that part. Courtney makes a great in-house designer if she needs to be.
But like all of them. No, I don't have a brand that I mean, I'll take any brands that want to work with me, but I always joke I have a class that I would want to teach for teaching. I always would want to, but I always joke that the class that I want to teach, the dream class would be one on creative block kind of thing.
Oh yeah, no, I love that too. I gave a presentation at a ground on creative block. Actually, I should share that with you. So.
Okay, well,
maybe we can team up.
Yeah.
We can host another conversation with both of you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Just be like,
we were lucky I didn't join, Kendra. You know how we chatted earlier that maybe I should stay on the call because I wanted to mention so many things as you were talking, Courtney. So it's good I didn't join because this would have lasted an hour and a half. I have so many things to chat offline with you, especially the thing about health insurance brands becoming more hip. I always think that if they're trying to make you feel like you should take care of yourself so that you pay for healthcare but don't need it, I think that's the game they're playing. That's the long game. So take care of yourself,
probably is.
but you pay don't use the service, you know. Yeah, I loved my typography classes when I was in university, so I really enjoyed that conversation too.
Awesome.
And yeah, so I think that kind of brings it to the end. We are at an hour and 2 minutes, so we're a bit over. And we had a couple of people join. Not many questions in the chat, but we had people watching live, which is great. And then we're gonna be pushing this to YouTube as a video itself too. So there'll be some conversation there too. Courtney, this was refreshing. Hey, look, we have
I saw that. Yeah.
Yay! Oh, great! Excellent. I'm glad you thought it was refreshing.
Yeah, Mirella is a guest here at EA Live, so she just chatted with us.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Hey, how's everyone? Jose is here too.
Jose, thank you.
So, yeah, people enjoyed.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney. Really appreciated it. And as I said on our pre-call, I was like, I could just like talk to you for like hours and hours and hours, and we could just, it might get boring after a while, but we can do this anytime you want. And this was awesome. Thank you so much for
absolutely. Thank you guys so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. See you next time.
Everybody. Take care.